Now, hundreds of families are still trying to retrieve the remains of their loved ones from some developed suburbs of Johannesburg. Before Dainfern Estate was developed, thousands of families occupied the land and a handful of burial sites remained. amaBhungane's investigative journalist Zanele Mji has been investigating this story, and thank you for coming on to Newsnight tonight. Now, this is one of those stories that perhaps, you know, it almost forces you to go back into history, because we have this beautiful, flourishing suburb that now falls under fourways, and it's growing by the day. But then you also have the plight of these families who are talking about how this land belonged to them and there's still graves on part of the suburb.
Yes, of course, exactly. And I think that's the power of this story. It shows us that, you know, you can be prim and proper and curated and beautiful and gorgeous and have this bright future. But as South Africans, we have this difficult past that we can't escape, that still haunts us.
And when you went out to investigate, what exactly were you looking at?
I was looking at this fascinating story that this brand new looking fancy estate was built on bones. That's what I heard. I'd met a gentleman, a cab driver, who was driving me through the estate to go and visit family, and he told me, I used to live here, my ancestors were buried here, and we're looking for them.
And you followed up on that conversation?
And I followed that story, and then that's when I uncovered the layers, and that's when I realized, okay, the scope of the story is huge. It takes us all the way back to colonialism, and through the centuries and through the ages, and all of the characters who come in along that way and have some responsibility and a role to play in where these families found themselves today.
Let's talk about that step back into history. You talk about colonialism. The 1800s more specifically, that's how far back the story goes.
Yes, one of the gentlemen I spoke to, one of his great-grandfather's grave is intact in Cosmo City in the northern suburbs, and it dates back to 1888.
So, I mean, we're seeing some of the visuals on a screen now that,
yes,
that you've been able to put together the pictures as part of the story. How do they describe how they were actually dispossessed of this land? What is the story that they tell?
So, you know, what I uncovered with this story is that it happened in cycles. This kind of thing doesn't happen all at once. So, you know, they have their tribal land, their ancestral land in 1918. Their land was seized by government and assigned to soldiers returning from World War I, and they were forced to then become labor tenants, and so they had to work basically for free to stay there. And that was the first generation, and then the second generation from there was caught up in the forced evictions of the 70s and the 80s. And in the story I wrote that they describe it as so sudden that that morning they took their animals out to graze, and there was no one there to bring them back at night.
Some of those exhumations and even the moving of the graves has taken place in recent history.
Yes.
And to a large extent, that almost became what, you know, you call it, as they describe those graves as their title deeds to that land. What does it mean now?
Well, that is the question. That is what it means. I mean, we are now, the debate around land expropriation and restitution is flared up again in South Africa. And I don't know, for me, this story represented how complex it can be sometimes, you know. Where does it leave a family like the family I wrote about, who, for them, they've never had this paper called the title deed. It was actually something used against them. All they have is their oral history, their graves, and the history that they know to be true. And so what do they do now in 2018 when we're supposed to be past all that happened back then? How do they fix it? How do they get back what was theirs? How do,
firstly, the authorities respond to this plight of these residents, and secondly, the property developers, many of whom would have been involved in the process of moving these graves to build, whether it's a mall, whether it's shopping centers, what do they have to say?
Well, I think when you talk about the authorities, it's a difficult situation where, because a lot of people are poor, they are up against wealthy developers who have the education, the resources, the social capital. These people don't even really know what their options are. So it kind of, they get faced with this idea of like, oh, do we litigate against people who can always afford to drag us through court? They don't know who to turn to. And that's why I even wrote in my story, they've said they've tried to go to the police, they've tried to go to the public protector, they've tried all these avenues, the hawks, they mention all these different things they've tried, and really, there's resolution at the end of the story, but there isn't really resolution because they don't know. And I think when you ask me about the property developers, I think the thing about cycles of dispossession is that we get to the point where now, in 2018, these people's connection to the land has been so severed that often these evictions are kind of legal in the sight of the law. These developers they're advised in how to do these things so that they aren't breaking the law. But of course, it's more complex than just what's legal.
What would they want to see happen now, this community that you have spoken to? What is the recourse for them in this matter?
They want to be compensated, from what I gathered. And what I learned through this story is it's about so much more than just the land. It's what was lost. It's houses, brick and mortar houses. It's cattle. They talked about they had cows, sheep, goats. They had all sorts of things, and they could only take what could fit on a truck. It's furniture. It's all of those things. I think through compensation, at least it would feel to them like people are recognizing just what land dispossession does to a family over generations.
And for people who want to get more on the story, because you have done some comprehensive work on it, where can they go?
I would suggest that you continue to follow amaBhungane. There are more stories just like this in the area that I hope to be uncovering soon and sharing.
All right, and we'll certainly look forward to keeping up to tabs with those stories. It really is a compelling read. If you have a moment, you can go to the amaBhungane website just to have a read through Zanele Mji's story and what happens, questions over what happens next for these families. I mean, Fourways continues to be a growing and a bustling suburb, but of course, as you walk there, in some parts you'll find these graves that have such a longer and bigger story about the history of that area. And what is the responsibility then on the authorities of the day to try and give credence to that history? And that's the very question that Zanele is trying to address through this series of stories that she's covering.